It's no secret that the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG is built upon power creep, which is the idea that cards must get progressively stronger with each release. Since the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG doesn't have any kind of rotation in the same way that Pokemon and Magic do, the main way that Konami tries to sell new products, other than by banning cards, is making cards stronger and stronger to tempt competitive players into spending a ton of money on new decks several times a year. However, to give them a little bit of credit, in recent years Konami have done a decent job of this and made sure there are numerous decks each format so that competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't become monotonous. For example, in Yu-Gi-Oh! Earlier this year, despite how pushed the Sword Soul archetype was, other archetypes like Prank Kids and Phantom Knights still managed to keep up with it. However, every once in a while, Konami takes things way too far when pushing certain cards and decks, and makes decks that take the game and break it more than a day one Ubisoft title. And that's what I'll be looking at here today. These are the decks that were the only ones viable in their formats, the ones that warped the game around them, and the ones that made Konami take a step back and think, you know what, maybe selling a pack isn't worth destroying our game. So today we're looking at the strongest decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! History. I think this list is fairly self-explanatory, and it will consist mostly of decks that were either tier 0 or tier 0.5, or in other words, decks that had over 65% of their meta. The only rule is we won't be looking at any pure FTK decks, as they can be difficult to judge. Also, please note that while I've tried to organise these decks into a ranking, when it comes to decks this powerful, you can make a case for several of them being above or below another, and so some of these rankings are arbitrary. With all that being said, let's begin. If you want to see a time period when morale for this game was at low, look no further than most of 2008. We were at the tail end of the GX era, and to be blunt, most of the GX sets have been terrible in regards to their competitive viability, with only a few cards from each set seeing play alongside the DM staples. However, as this era drew to a close, the card designers at Konami seemed to be determined to make up for earlier failures and released 3 sets that would dramatically alter the game state. One of them, Phantom Darkness, we'll discuss later in this list, as the cards in that set created one of the most powerful decks of all time. In fact, it was so powerful that players turned to an archetype from the previous set to combat it, Gladiator Beasts, only for the previous deck to be hit hard on the ban list and leave Gladiator Beasts to go from conquering hero to tier 0 boogeyman overnight, being so strong they even won Worlds that year. There were 2 main aspects that made Gladiator Beasts so powerful. Firstly, it was the first deck to have fusion monsters that were both extremely powerful and also very easy to bring out. With each fusion being a contact fusion that required shuffling 2 beasts back into the deck without using a fusion spell, it meant the deck often only required one specific card to make its fusions, greatly increasing the deck's consistency. Also for the time, these were 2 of the most powerful fusion monsters ever made. Gladiator Beast Heraclinos is probably the more famous of the 2, a 3000 attack body that for the cost of a discard could negate spells and traps, not once per turn by the way. But this alone makes this card good by today's standards, so imagine how good it was back in 2008 when the game was much slower than today and when card advantage was the most important part of the game. In addition to this, we had the other Gladiator Beast fusion at the time, Gladiator Beast Quasaris, a 2400 attack fusion that upon being summoned could pop any 2 cards on the field. Now this might not be as powerful today, but back when we had less floating effects and chainable back row, this was a lot more potent. Not to mention that with the old priority ruling, which allowed this effect to always be chain link 1, it was very hard to interrupt. Finally, this card had the effect of being able to tag out, meaning you could return to the extra deck and summon 2 Gladiator Beasts from the main deck, meaning you could pop the one's best cards, then tag out and summon another monster that could deal damage or go into Heraclinos. Complementing these 2 powerful fusions was a main deck of powerful monsters such as Glad Beasts, Bestiari and Liguari, who all had the ability to tag themselves out to bring each other out, thus increasing the consistency of bringing the fusions out even more. In addition to this, Bestiari was an MST on a stick. Finishing this deck's monster lineup, we had some of the best generic cards of the time, such as E-Hero Prisma, Sangan and DD Crow. Finishing this deck off was some of the most powerful back row seen in the game at this point, with cards like Solemn Judgment at 3, Cold Wave and Heavy Storm to prevent back row, and trying to wipe the board. It was very hard to play against this deck's back row. Overall, Glad Beast set the tone for future anti-meta decks, and were the first truly competitive fusion deck of all time. For these reasons, I grant it number 10 on this list. Our next deck on this list is by far the least dominant, barely meeting the criteria of a 65% cut at top events that qualifies as a tier 0 deck. However, don't let that fact make you think that full power Necros wasn't an absolute terror in its prime. Firstly, this may be the most consistent deck ever made, with almost any combination of cards being playable. If any deck can be pointed to as an example of why future-proofing cards is important, this would be it, as even before looking at the archetype-specific cards, the amount of searching this deck had was insane. With 3 copies of Manju and 3 copies of Senju, pretty much any card you needed in this deck in terms of its rituals was just 1 normal summon away, combined with 3 preparation of rites and 3 pre-preps, as well as the somehow unlimited reinforcements of the army, and you have a deck that will have the answer to whatever the opponent can have at any time. Finally, in terms of non-archetypal consistency, we had the extra deck monster Larval Chain, which could force barrel the 1 card in this deck we always wanted into the graveyard. However, a deck being consistent only matters if the cards are good, so let's have a look, shall we? What makes the Necros deck so powerful is that all the Necros ritual monsters have effects in the field and hand trap-like qualities in the hand. This makes the deck both very powerful but also very adaptable to whatever the opponent has going on, and you can fairly easily change your strategy on the fly. Cards like Colossalus and Bryonic both added to the deck's consistency by being able to be cashed in for Necros spells and monsters respectively, while making life hard for extra deck players on the field, with Klaus being able to reduce any extra deck monster points to 0 as a quick effect, while Bryonic could spin up to 2 of those monsters back into the extra deck. Meanwhile, cards like Necros of Trishula and Gungnir both offered protection in their hand trap form, with Gungnir offering battle and effect protection, while Trishula offered targeted negation. Trishula also offers an effect similar to the legendary Synchro, whose name it's based on, being able to banish 1 card from the opponent's hand, field and graveyard, while Gungnir offers a monster pop at the cost of a discard. Finally, we have Necros of Valkyros, which with a negate attack in the hand and card draw on the field, and Necros of Unicorn, which allows us to add a Necros back to the hand from grave for its hand trap effect, and is a floodgate to all extra deck monsters while on the field, being able to shut down the effects of all of them. In addition to all this, the deck's rituals could be searched from the deck with various Necros monster effects, and each of them had the ability to search another one from deck, banishing themselves and a Necros from the graveyard, which gave the deck consistency other ritual decks lacked. Adding to this consistency, we also had the archetype's only normal summon, Insure-It, which not only acts as a tribute for any ritual summon of a Necros monster, but also gives us a search for another Necros when tributed. Finally, this deck had almost constant access through Larval Chain to Jin, Releaser of Rituals, a monster that could be banished from grave for any ritual summon, and then as long as that monster remains on the field, you had a Domain of the True Monarch's lock, locking your opponents out of the extra deck. All these things combined made it hard for any deck not filled with traps to play in the meta, much in the same way that VFD did with Virtual World a decade later. All of this basically destroyed the previous Duelist Alliance decks, leaving scraps for Burning Abyss and Klee decks to pick up. It's true Necros wasn't quite as dominant as the other decks coming up, hence it only being number 9 on this list, but for its insane consistency and the way it warped the meta around it, I couldn't leave it off of this list. Up next, we have a deck that I admittedly couldn't find too much information about, so if you played during a trade and I get some details wrong, please forgive me. The first of several examples of one card breaking a deck wide open, Six Samurai were already a competitive deck for several years, always hanging about but never breaking into the upper echelons of the game. Then Konami released a new wave of Six Samurai support in the form of the legendary Six Samurai, which combined with the already waiting to be broken Gateway of the Six, gave the deck literally infinite amounts of combo potential. Like another deck I'll be mentioning soon, the power of this deck came from a busted spell, so we'll begin with that. Gateway of the Six is a continuous spell that gains 2 Bushido counters whenever a Six Samurai is played. These counters could then be cashed in to either increase a samurai's attack points, search a samurai from deck to hand, and special summon a Shien from grave. Oh, and did I mention that these effects are not once per turn and can be stacked? Now, when this card was first released, it wasn't that powerful, as Six Samurai didn't have that many ways to spam the field. However, all that changed with the Legends. With Kizan acting as a pseudo Cyber Dragon and Kageki summoning 1 level 4 or lower samurai from deck on normal summon, building the required counters for at least 1 search with Gateway or a pot of greed with the Six Samurai United was fairly easy, and this allowed the deck to gain a large amount of card advantage. But you knew this deck wouldn't be on this list if that's all it did, didn't you? In addition to the powerful samurais already discussed, we had 2 other legendaries in the form of Shinai and Mizu, 2 monsters that when combined could infinitely summon and destroy each other. This combined with Gateway and any other Bushido card, like a second Gateway or United, will result in infinite Bushido counters, every 6 samurai in your deck being in your hand, and for good measure a Pot of Greed with United. From there it was just a matter of flooding the board, and then using the first effective Gateway to make all your monsters infinite attack beaters, and swinging in for the win, or if you're going first, setting up this board along with 2 destructive back row, like Solemn Warning you likely drew off of United, along with the Synchro Shogun Shien to lock down the opponent's back row, passing the turn and then killing them on the next turn. Adding this combo to a deck that was already consistent enough with 3 rotors, smoke signals and a Grandmaster Search took Samurai from being a good deck to one of the most busted of all time, earning it number 8 on this list. The next 2 places on this list are dedicated to 2 decks from the same format. Decks that in any other time period would have been tier 0, but because they occupy the same format, they turn the game into a 0.5 war. Now these decks could be in either order, but I've chosen to put spellbooks first. A spell-based control deck, this deck used the spellbook cards to both protect its field and gain card advantage before using the effect of Spellbook of Judgment to both refill its hand and lock down the board with Yugioh the Spiritualist. Before looking at the rest of the deck, let's take a closer look at Spellbook of Judgment, because it's one of the most insane archetype-specific spells I've ever seen. You think Engage is overpowered? Judgment spits in Engage's face and laughs. A quick play spell, Judgment allows the controller to add a spellbook to hand for each spell they played that turn. That's right, not just spellbook cards, but any spell. And keep in mind that this was nearly half a decade before Ash Blossom would be a thing, meaning players literally had no motivation to not simply dump every card they could in their hand in order to get the biggest plus possible for Judgment. And that wasn't even the best part. No, if it wasn't enough that this card essentially drew you an entirely new hand, it also allowed to special summon any spellcaster whose level was equal to or less than the amount of cards we added to our hand of a Judgment. Now, obviously this effect's intended purpose was to summon one of the archetype-specific monsters. However, you know I would make a big deal about this if that's what it was doing. No, instead, this card was used to special summon out Yugioh the Spiritualist, a floodgate on legs that, just like Jin, prevents special summoning, except this time it was any monster, not just from the extra deck. Also going second, Yugioh was actually a potential board breaker, if drawn, as its other ability allowed the controller to pop every special summon monster on the field at the cost of 1 card from their hand. I could end this segment here, as I think these 2 cards alone show why this deck was almost tier 0, but let's see what else we were working with at the time, for those who were not around during this deck's dominance. We have 2 other searches in the form of Good Old Blue Boy and Spellbook of Secrets, both of which allow us to add any spellbook to hand, because having 3 copies of the most broken search card of all time wasn't enough, why not have 9? These cards, along with the deck's archetypal Pot of Greed in Spellbook of Knowledge, and the mini Judgment tutoring effect on Spellbook Star Hall, made the deck hyper-consistent, while Spellbook of the Master gave the deck even more redundancy by allowing us to reuse any normal spellbook in the grave, and Spellbook of Wisdom granted our monsters protection on field. Finally, we had the field spell that did it all, from cycling our spellbooks to drawing us cards, to allowing us another way to turbo out DRAGOON or Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer, a card we play to counter the other top deck of the format. While this deck isn't higher up on the list due to sharing the format's top spot with another deck, the fact that it could match that deck's power level, and that it had possibly the most powerful archetypal spell ever printed, undoubtedly earns it a spot on this list. Now looking at the second deck to dominate the 2013 format, we have Dragon Rulers. Again, I'm aware this deck could be higher on this list, but the fact that it technically isn't a tier 0 deck is why it's in the middle of the pack alongside its rival spellbooks. As the name suggests, Rulers were a deck focused on a series of dragon monsters, one of each in fire, water, wind and earth, that all shared a similar summoning condition of being able to be summoned from the deck or grave by banishing either 2 dragons, 2 monsters they shared a card type with, or one of each from hand and graveyard. In addition to this, every ruler also had a mini version of themselves, which would allow you to search the corresponding ruler by discarding them and a dragon or appropriate attribute monster. Now, the ability to essentially have 6 copies of all your main deck monsters, along with all the draw power we'll see later, obviously made this deck consistent. However, what makes rulers so powerful is how resilient the deck is. With each ruler being able to come back from the grave, rebuilding your board was super easy, making rulers one of the best decks at both going first and second, something many decks are unable to do. With the deck easily being able to play at least 2 level 7s per turn, it made it possible to repeatedly summon the best ranked 7XCs of the time in Draco Sack and Big Eye. By today's standards, these probably don't look that impressive, and they make a board that most decks now can easily outclass. However, back in 2013, these cards, especially Draco Sack, were very difficult to out, with Draco Sack being immune to both battle and effect destruction, and having the ability to create 2 tokens and then sacrifice them to pop 2 of our opponent's monsters. However, if you were to face this deck in a mirror match, a very common occurrence around this time, don't worry because Big Eye has your back with the ability to steal any monster our opponent controls, meaning we take their Draco Sacks and both build our own board and protect our field. As in the best hand traps available at the time in Max C, Effect Veiler and Swift Scarecrow, and you had a very powerful yet streamlined monster lineup. In addition to the broken monster lineup, the deck also had 3 of the most powerful back row ever created. Firstly, there was Vanity's Emptiness, a continuous trap that prevents both players from special summoning. As we've seen with the Jin lock in Necros, preventing special summoning is often crippling to some decks. Yet in some ways, Emptiness can be even worse, since it blows itself up when a card hits our graveyard, essentially allowing its controller to turn it off at will by using Draco Sack to sacrifice a token. Secondly, there's Super Rejuvenation, a quick play spell that during our end step allows us to draw a card for each dragon discarded or sent to our graveyard this turn. I mentioned the cards in Necros being great examples of not future-proofing, and this could be the poster boy for this. Made back in 2003, this card was designed for dragon decks at the time, and meant to combo with weak dragons like Spirit Rue. Of course, most of the dragon monsters back then were either too weak or too hard to summon, so this card never saw any play for a decade, and I'm 100% sure that Konami forgot this card even existed when making rulers. With the amount of discarding this deck does, it was very easy to make our full board and then rejuve for 6 or even more, seeing as rejuve is a quick play spell and not once per turn, meaning you could play 2 or 3 copies of this and then discard to hand size, thus setting up your graveyard for next turn. The final back row is also an old card, but this time I can absolutely blame it on Konami because it was an OCG exclusive from 2004 that everyone knew would be broken and so was not ported into the TCG until 2013, 6th Sense. A normal trap, 6 cents, let us roll a 6-sided die and call 2 numbers. Then if we roll a number we called, we get to draw that many cards. If not, we mill the number rolled. So we either draw 5 or 6 cards, or mill between 1 and 4 cards in a deck that wants its grave full. This card honestly should have stayed in the OCG, and it only took 1 ban list before it was banned with good flipping reason. Outside of these 3 powerhouses, the deck played all the best back row cards not yet banned, including Sacred Sword of 7 Stars, a card that draws 2 at the cost of discarding a level 7. And yes, this did come out in the same set as the rulers. Heavy Storm for back row removal, and interaction spells with Book of Moon and Forbidden Chalice. Also, as if the deck didn't have enough ways to dump rulers into the graveyard, we also included a Dragon Ravine. Overall, rulers and spellbooks were on fairly even footing in their prime, hence their similar ranking. However, I chose to put rulers higher because A, they were by far the more iconic of the two, and B, they had a far longer life in the game. Whereas spellbooks faded away after losing Judgment, rulers would continue to be a force to reckon with within the next year. For those reasons, I give Dragon Rulers number 5 on this list. As hard as this is to believe, nowadays there was a time when Yu-Gi-Oh! Didn't actually have a forbidden list. Yes, from 2002 until 2004, there were no cards considered so powerful that they were warranted being illegal in tournament play. Keep in mind, it's not like broken cards weren't printed around this time, as cards like Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity, the Magic Ruler hand attack cards, Pre-Errata Imperial Order, and Mirage of Nightmare had all been printed at this point. Yet despite these broken cards that we'd never see printed nowadays, no deck was deemed powerful enough that Konami feared for the health of the game, with most of the monsters being either big beaters or small monsters with decent effects, and the spell-heavy decks being vulnerable to attack. We had a format fairly balanced between spell-heavy hand attack decks and aggro-focused beatdown strategies, and had a decent enough format. Then along came Invasion of Chaos and everything went to hell. This set brought in many powerful cards to the game, such as Berserk Gorilla, Chaos Sorcerer, Compulse, and Dimension Fusion, all powerful additions at the time. However, in addition to this, we got 2 of the strongest monsters ever printed at that point, in Blackluster Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning, and Chaos Emperor Dragon, Envoy of the End. These 2 cards broke the general rule of Yu-Gi-Oh! Monsters at the time, being both powerful effect monsters and large beaters, and on top of that, they were both super easy to bring out, requiring only 1 dark and 1 light to be banished from the graveyard. We'll start with the card that has seen the most play due to being unbanned the longest in Blackluster Soldier Envoy of the Beginning. Sharing the same stats as the original Blackluster Soldier, it has two simple effects. It can either banish one monster on the field at the cost of an attack, or make 2 attacks each battle phase. This is still a good effect today, but back then a card this powerful was unprecedented, as it had the ability to both run over most monsters played at the time, and also avoid attacking into monsters with powerful flip effects, which the format was full of at the time. However, none of this compares to the terror that was pre-errated Chaos Emperor Dragon. Sharing the same stats as BLS, Dragon had the ability that for 1,000 life points, it could destroy every card on the field and in both players' hands, and deliver 300 points of damage to the opponent for each card destroyed. Now, by itself this is a powerful effect that can do between 300 and up to 10,000 damage. Not likely I know, but one can dream. While also attacking for 3,000, meaning this card by itself could be an OTK a decent amount of time. However, when combined with another card in this deck, we pretty much had a guaranteed win some of the time. To give you an idea of how powerful this card was, it's currently in second place for the record of the longest banned card in Yu-Gi-Oh history. Complementing this terrifying duo was Yatagarasu, which is the only card to be banned longer than Emperor, having been banned on the very first list and never coming off. Why? Because Yata has the effect that whenever it deals battle damage, it prevents the opponent from drawing during their next draw phase. So in other words, if the opponent had no cards in hand, one direct attack from Yata was almost a guaranteed game ender. Now imagine this effect alongside Emperor, and I think you'll see why this deck necessitated the creation of the ban list. In most cases, you only need 2 cards to pull this combo off, that being Emperor and either Yata directly or an effect to search it like Witch of the Black Forest or Sangan. However, what made Chaos so strong was that it wasn't a one-trick pony, as this powerful combo slotted nicely into a standard control shell. With cards like Demark and Magician of Faith to bring back spells, and the aforementioned searchers, the deck could play a long game very well. Also, the deck had access to powerful removal for the time, in the forms of DD Warrior Lady, which also doubled as a light target for Chaos bosses, Breaker, which was a good beater for the time, and Tribe-Infecting Virus, a board wipe on legs that could also help fill our graveyard. Finally, some builds of this deck also ran Magical Scientist, a card banned almost as long as Yata, which gave them access to every fusion in their extra deck to both increase their attack forces for another potential OTK and provide more grave setup for BLS and Emperor. While this deck's monsters were groundbreaking and ungodly powerful for the time, I think it's safe to say they've been severely power creeped out of the game by this point. Not so with the deck's spell lineup, which may be the strongest of any deck on this list due to all the broken DM staples it runs. First, we have every broken draw card ever made at the time, from Pot of Greed drawing us 2, to Graceful Charity drawing us 3, and setting up the grave for Chaos plays, to Painful Choice drawing us 5 cards. No, I don't care what the card actually says. In a deck like Chaos that relies this much on its grave, this card might as well say draw 5, as it lets us put 1 card to our hand and dump 4 to the graveyard. Next we have the removal for both back row and monsters, including Raigeki, Dark Hole, Nobleman of Crossout and Smashing Ground for monsters, and Harpy's Feather Duster, Heavy Storm and MST for back row. Again, some very powerful cards on this list, with Harpy still seeing play to this day, Raigeki only being power crept a couple of years ago, and Heavy Storm still being banned. With these cards alongside DD Warrior and Emperor, it was super easy for this deck to keep the opponent's field clear. Finally, we had the hand attack cards from Spell Ruler in Confiscation and the Forceful Century, along with potentially Drop Off and Delinquent Duo, most of which are still on the ban list to this very day. These cards allowed the Chaos player to both deal with any threats before they hit the table, and also granted them another way to access the Yata lock by manually stripping cards from the opponent's hand until they had nothing left. Finally, the traps were mostly the standard generic good ones, like Mirror Force, Sakuretsu Armor, and Ring of Destruction. However, the OCG version had one card different to the TCG, and it made their version much more powerful. We've seen already how good Sixth Sense was in the TCG when it came in a decade later, and it wasn't any less powerful in Chaos. Obviously, drawing 5 or 6 cards is just as good here as it was in Rulers. However, the ability to dump several cards into the grave with this, Charity and Choice, greatly accelerated the pace we could bring out Chaos monsters. Again, Chaos might not be that powerful by today's standards, although as Lithium's Cross-Banner Cup shows, it can still hold its own against some modern decks, but it being arguably the first Tier 0 deck ever made, and its importance in Yu-Gi-Oh history, more than qualifies it for number 5 on this list. Before we move on to the final 4 decks in this list, I would like to say that from this point on, the rankings for these decks will be even more arbitrary than they already were. In reality, each of these decks could be considered the most powerful deck in the game, but I had ranked them in some kind of order, so here we go. For our next deck, let's talk about the Xyz summoning mechanic. Out of all the mechanics introduced to the game in the 2010s, I'd argue Xyz are the most balanced in terms of their summoning condition, in that it usually isn't too specific, like synchro summoning, but not as broad as something like link summoning either. Usually requiring 2 monsters to bring them out, usually 2 generic monsters of the same level and occasionally type, while occasionally requiring more specific monsters. Xyz usually have the best cost to power ratio of all Yu-Gi-Oh! Extra monsters. Sorry, can we mess this up? By literally throwing the Xyz rulebook out the window into a paper shredder and creating Zodiac. An archetype focused around beast warriors, what made Zoo so powerful is the fact that all of their Xyz can be summoned by overlaying over any other Zodiac, essentially giving this deck an extra deck filled with 1 card Xyz, thus giving us all the power of Xyz monsters without any of the restrictions that keep them balanced. Let's begin with their deck's main starter in Zodiac Rapier. A level 4 monster, Rapier had the ability to foolish any Zoo card on summon, which combined well with the archetype's Jar of Avarice effect. However, what made this card powerful was the effect it gave a Zodiac XC upon being used as material, which allowed the player to detach 1 material and summon another rat from the deck. This effect meant 1 rat could result in 2 Xyz at minimum, and playing this card was the deck's main focus, with numerous ways to access rat, including 3 rats themselves, an MX Saber Invoker, 5 Formation Tenki, and Zodiac Barrage. Other main deck monsters included Zodiac Whiptail, a monster that both granted any Zoo a quick play 1200 point boost, and gave them the ability to bash monsters they battled, and Zodiac Thoroughblade, which was the biggest normal summon in the deck and also offered card selection and piercing damage. However, what made Zoo so powerful were their Xyz, in particular Zodiac's Trident and Broadbull. Broadbull had the ability to search any beast warrior from the deck for 1 detach. Now obviously this card could be used to grab a Zoo like Rapier to continue Zoo plays, however it could also be used to grab Lunalight Black Sheep. This enabled the deck's strongest combo by searching out Fusion Substitute to go into Elder Entity Norden, a fusion that let us bring any level 4 back from the grave. This card, combined with a rank 4 named DAIGUSTO EMERAL, created a combo that allows Zoo players to draw several cards for basically free, in addition to the usual Zodiac end board, meaning in addition to the usual disruptions, the deck could potentially draw several counter traps and hand traps to back them up. The other big XC of the deck was Zodiac Trident, which was the deck's end plan. A simple card that allows us to detach 1 material during either player's turn to pop 1 face-up card on the field. Now I know compared to the other decks we've seen so far this doesn't seem that strong, but what made Trident and Zoo as a whole so powerful was the fact that Trident plus a rank 4 was the minimum board the deck could make every single turn of the game due to Zoo monsters' easy summoning conditions and the recyclability of cards like DAIGUSTO Emerald and Zodiac combo, meaning that a player not only had to play through Zodiac boards once, but every single turn of the game, and 90% of the time any other deck would run out of resources long before Zodiac would. The final aspect that made Zoo so powerful was its splashability. Due to Zoo only needing 1 card to start its plays, it meant the archetype could be slotted into many different decks with ease. This included True Draco Zoo, which used Trident as an extra piece of disruption along with Masterpiece, Artifact Zoo, which used Trident to trigger cards like Moraltac and Scythe, and Kaiju Zoo, a going second variant that aimed at out opposing Tridents and other Zoos with Kaijus and Slumber before making their own Zoo board. How powerful were Zodiacs in their prime? They're one of only 2 decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! History to get 100% at a major event, taking all 32 spots at a YCS in 2017, a feat that has not been achieved since, and has only been recorded once in the past. For its sheer dominance, splashability and power, I think Zoo deserves the number 4 spot on this list. It's often said that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a pay-to-win game, with those who do best consistently spending hundreds of dollars on decks a year. While that may be true, I would say that in most formats these days, there's always at least 1 deck that can be built on the cheap and still do well, be it Virtual World nowadays, Burning Abyss for years, etc. However, there was at least 1 point in Yu-Gi-Oh! History where the game undoubtedly was pay-to-win. Remember when I said that the morale for Yu-Gi-Oh! Was low in 2008? Well, most of that was down to the beginning and end of the year being dominated by Dark Arm Dragon decks, and they weren't cheap, with some version of Dad decks going for over $2,000, due to Konami being Konami and bumping Dad's rarity, so it was around $200 each. Beginning the year off with Dad Return decks that use Return from the Different Dimension and Dimension Fusion along with Dad's Banish effect to make huge boards. However, that deck was quickly trounced by Gladiator Beasts as we discussed earlier in the video. However, Dark Armed Dragon players refused to stay down and revamped their decks into the number 3 on this list, Teledad. Named after the deck's two main cards, Emergency Teleport and Dark Armed Dragon, Teleport relied on the newly introduced Synchro monsters, alongside Dark Armed himself, to grind the opponent out with huge beaters and ensure a win. The first thing that made Teledad so powerful was the amount of new search and draw cards printed around this time, many of which are still seeing play today. These include a Lord of Darkness, a very powerful card at this time, as most of the most popular monsters played were Darks, Destiny Draw, Elemental Hero Stratos to search many of the D heroes we run, the Arts 2 reinforcements of the army for warriors Stratos can't get, and the new Pot of Greed effect in Destiny Hero Disc Commander, which combined with the somehow unbanned Monster Reborn, was exceptionally powerful. Alongside this, we had cards like foolish cards into the graveyard, like Armageddon Knight and Dark Grepher, that were both searchable off of reinforcements. These cards both allowed the deck to draw and search a ton of cards to further plays, while also setting up the grave with cards such as Destiny Hero Malicious and Plague Spreader Zombie, to both easily summon out Dad and make level 6 and 8 Synchro monsters. Outside of the boss monsters, which we'll discuss later, the deck ran removal from a Breaker the Magical Warrior and Snipe Hunter, a card that was one of the few ways that players could out Stardust Dragon reliably at the time. The deck also ran Krebons, a level 2 Psychic Tuner that for 800 life points could negate any attack made against it, making it extremely difficult to remove. This, along with the 3 E-Tellies to search it, made Synchro summoning level 6s and 8s both easy and super effective in this deck, as Synchro monsters were by far the best extra deck monsters in the game at this point. Then we have the deck's namesake card, Dark Armed Dragon, which did in 2008 what the Chaos Monsters did in 2004 and completely turned the game on its head by being easy to bring out, super powerful in terms of attack points, and having an extremely busted effect. Dad required us to have exactly 3 Darks in the grave to special summon it, which with our deck being mostly dark and filled with cards to manipulate the graveyard was very easy to achieve quickly, possibly even turn 1, although not too likely. Then, once Dad hit the field, you could banish a Dark from grave to pop 1 card on the field. And by the way, this wasn't once per turn, so once Dad was on the field, if you could fill up the grave with Dark monsters, this 1 card could wipe out the opponent's entire board. Supporting Dark Armed Dragon was the Synchro monsters the deck ran, the most prominent of which being Stardust Dragon. A level 8 Synchro, Stardust had the ability to protect all of our monsters from destruction by sacrificing itself. It would then come back to the field during the end step. Back in 2008, this was an extremely difficult thing to out reliably, as any piece of removal will trigger its effect and put it out of reach until next turn. This, by the way, is why Snipe Hunter was ran, as this card couldn't be negated by Stardust due to it not being a guaranteed destruction. As you can imagine, a card like Dark Armed Dragon backed up by Stardust was truly terrifying to out in 2008, and the rest of the Synchros were just as powerful. Chief among these was Goyo Guardian, a level 6 that could steal any monster it destroyed and summon it to our field, allowing us to steal rival Stardust, Snipe Hunters, and other goodies. This card was so good in fact that it needed to be errated into uselessness before being unbanned. Throw in cards like Red Dragon Archfiend and Black Rose Dragon and you had an extra deck to be feared at the time. Complementing this lineup of powerful monsters was a brutal collection of back row. I've already mentioned all of this deck's draw power, but this deck also had access to powerful traps like Crush Card Virus, pre-errated, which in a deck comprised nearly of all dark monsters was always a dangerous card. Solemn Judgment, arguably the most powerful trap in the game at that point, and Royal Oppression, which was the first iteration of a Jin Lock effect, a card that for 800 points allowed both players to negate any special summon. Now, while this might technically be symmetrical, we're never going to flip this card until we've already set up, meaning our opponent had to deal with a board of Stardust, Dark Armed and possibly other Synchros with no special summons. Yeah, there's a reason this card's been banned for so long. Again, like Chaos, Teledad may not be that powerful by today's standards, but its dominance of the game, legacy it left behind, and it being a historical moment in Yu-Gi-Oh history, representing a major leap forward in the game's speed, earns at number 3 on this list. I mentioned that morale for this game was low in 2008, but doesn't compare to how things were near the end of 2017. The game had just gone through one of the longest Tier 0 formats it had ever had with Zodiac, and with the deck's main cards getting banned, and with the introduction of the new link mechanic, many people were expecting the game to slow down, because apparently we all forgot how Konami design Yu-Gi-Oh cards these days. Yeah, it turns out that, rather than links slowing down the format, they just gave combo decks a more consistent way to lock down the field, because some world-class intellect said that links should have the ability to extra link, or use the opponent's extra monster zone if you fill up your own board. Because yeah, Konami, you realised that Vantage Emptiness, Royal Oppression and the Jin were stupidly badly designed cards, when I give every deck access to them. Prior to the release of Links, SPYRAL was a mediocre at best control deck that was seen playing in some locals that relied on guessing the top card of your opponent's deck for its abilities. Then came SPYRAL Double Helix and the rest of the new Link monsters, and overnight the deck became a combo menace, one of the most powerful and difficult to outboards ever seen. What made this deck so powerful was the ease in which it could spit out Link monsters backed up by disruption. This began with the two machine Spyrals, SPYRAL Quick Fix and Gear Drone, with Quick Fix searching out more cards to extend our combos, and Drone stuck at the top of our opponent's decks to trigger other SPYRAL effects. By themselves, these effects would already be good, however there are two things to know about these cards. One, they're not once per turns, and two, they're both machine duplication targets. This meant that opening either of these cards in a dupe could mean a double helix, a master plan, and another Link monster. This was particularly powerful with Quick Fix, as it could also search us up to 3 SPYRAL Gear cards when being repeatedly summoned. This, combined with its ability to bring us back from the grave multiple times by using excess material, made Quick Fix one of the biggest one-card advantage machines ever printed. Further search power came from Double Helix being able to search Master Plan, followed by Master Plan adding 1 card off of being summoned and a field spell, plus a monster upon leaving the field. Because of this, SPYRAL's ability to generate field presence made producing enough monsters to extra link a breeze, helped out in no small part by one of the worst designed monsters ever printed in FIREWALL Dragon. A Link 4 monster, FIREWALL in its pre-errata form, allowed us to summon a monster from our hand whenever a monster linked to it got destroyed or sent to the graveyard. This gave the deck the necessary extension to create extra link boards, as well as end that board with the ability to bounce several of our opponent's cards due to FIREWALL Dragon's quick effect. With all of this deck searching, we could then end the turn on a potential extra link, several bounces with 2 or more firewalls, and a gate with Tri-Gate Wizard and the most powerful SPYRAL in Sleeper being equipped with Last Resort, making it an indestructible, untargetable monster that could pop 2 of our opponent's monsters every turn. Now this combo is already pretty impressive, but what makes it worse was with most links being fairly generic, SPYRAL could often use non-archetypal cards like Grinder Golem and Go for the Vague Shadow to help make these broken boards more easy, and also that due to how the small amount of main deck monsters the deck ran, it could squeeze in a ton of hand traps like Max C, Ash Blossom, Ghost Ogre and DD Crow to name a few. Now SPYRAL was incredibly strong, but one of the reasons I have it this high up is the impact this deck left on the game. As I said in the intro, this deck's run was a time of low morale in Yu-Gi-Oh, with it coming on the heels of another Tier 0 deck in Zodiac, and players were just sick of it. Seriously, go look up any profile from that time period, and it's likely to hear players talking about low attendance numbers and the general lack of enjoyment people were having, and Konami took notice, hitting the deck with an emergency limiting of both Drone and Quick Fix a mere month after Double Helix's release. Also, since this deck, we've never had another Tier 0 format in Yu-Gi-Oh! And since 2019, it seems Konami has taken steps to slightly decrease the power level of new archetypes, to ensure something like SPYRAL never happens again. So for its combination of multiple formats, the amount of damage it did to Yu-Gi-Oh! As a game in the short term, and the effect it had on design going forward, I think SPYRAL has more than earned the number 2 spot on this list. SPYRAL was an absolute blight on the game that Konami had to potentially damage sales of a new product to weaken before it destroyed the game. However, at least with SPYRAL they waited a month before pulling the trigger on the emergency banning. The number 1 deck on this list was so broken it took them less than 2 weeks in the TCG to hit it hard. It was so broken and unfun to play against that Konami spent the next few years trying to do away with the deck's entire playstyle. So how to describe Pepe? Well, take any of the multi-negate pendulum decks Triff Gaming is known for, add the consistency of Necros or Zoo, and just for good measure, let's take away the most common ways people deal with combo decks nowadays, like Arch, Droplet, and Dark Ruler, as those cards were several years off being printed. and were most likely made as responses to decks like this. Sound broken? Oh, you've got no idea. Before diving into the deck's cards, again, much like Spiral, I have to call attention to the awfully designed mechanic that this deck was built around, and in this case even more so, because I truly believe that pre-Master Rule 4 Pendulum Summoning is the most broken mechanic Konami have ever made. For those who don't know, Pendulum monsters can be played as both monsters and spells, and have different abilities depending on where they're placed. Instead of going to the graveyard, these cards also get placed face up in the extra deck when destroyed. Finally, each Pendulum card has a scale number, and by setting up 2 of these in the spell and trap zone, you can perform a Pendulum Summon, where you can summon as many monsters as you have space for from your hand and face up from your extra deck, as long as their levels are between the 2 scales. This meant that prior to Master Rule 4, where extra deck's Pendulum monsters had to be summoned to extra deck monster zones, a Pendulum deck could empty their hand of monsters, use them to establish a board, and then pendulum them back for even more plays. If you thought Link Summoning giving every deck a Jinlock was powerful, how about giving every deck a Soul Charge? Because that's how much advantage Pendulum Summoning 5 from the extra deck felt like. So now that we've established how broken the Pendulum mechanic was back in the day, let me show you how Pepe took this and broke the game more than almost any other deck in existence. Firstly, as I said, this deck was possibly the most consistent deck ever made, up there with Necros and Zodiac. Starting off, this deck had not 1 but 2 Stratos monsters in the form of Performer Pal's Monkey Board and Skullcrabat Joker, both of which could be played on the same turn, since one triggered on summon and the other upon being set in the scales, and they both allowed us to fix our hands to counter the one weakness Pendulum decks had back in the day, which is not opening the correct scales. Adding on to this, we had the Draco engine in the form of Draco Face-Off and Luster Pendulum, with Face-Off essentially being a +1, allowing us to add 1 Draco to either the hand or Pendulum zone and the other to the extra deck, where it could be summoned later, and Draco being able to pop our scales to search another copy of the card it popped. Complementing the Performer Pals and Dracos with the Perform Mage cards. Perform Mage's Trick Clown, Hat Tricker, Damage Juggler and Plush Fire. All of these cards either special summon themselves to the field or search each other from deck, giving us both extra search power and field presence. Finally, in this deck, searching tools, we had Wavering Eyes, which in an era where there were no limits on extra deck Pendulum Summoning was far more powerful than it is nowadays, being able to pop both of our scales and search any Pendulum monster to the hand, then being able to Pendulum Summon them back later in the combo. With all these search options, we could grab our extenders to set up one of the most difficult outboards ever seen in the game up to that point. This is mostly done with the card Guiding Ariadne, which when destroyed allowed us to control it to search up to 3 counter traps, of which our opponent had to pick 1 and add to our hand. This card, combined with all the ways to pop scales and a card I'll mention in a second, made it super easy for the deck to set up 2 to 3 interruptions before even summoning from the extra deck, usually in the form of Solemn cards and Grand Horn of Heaven. In addition to this, one of the ways we had to pop Ariadne in Pendulum Sorcerer allowed us to add 2 pals to our hand, but also a Pot of Greed effect in the form of Perform Pal Lizard Draw and Good Turtle, each of which allowing us to draw 1 card. So we've seen our starters and extenders. What was the deck's end board like? Well, aside from the 2 to 3 counter traps, the deck's heavy emphasis on level 4 monsters made bringing out powerful rank 4 Xyz easy. The most powerful of these was Constellar Knight Ptolemaeus, which for the cost of detaching 3 materials could be turned into an Xyz 1 rank higher. This meant we could go into Cyber Dragon's Nova and then Infinity. Backing this up with either an Abyss Dweller to deal with graveyard decks, or a Trap Trickster Flazier to set up another disruption in a trap hole. This meant that this deck could on average produce 3 negates a turn, with a ceiling of 5 or 6. Now this isn't that impressive by today's standards. Pendulum decks nowadays can easily put up over 5 negates like it's nothing. However, this deck had one thing that not just Pendulum, but many combo decks in general lacked at the time, and that's insane comeback ability. So usually the trade-off with combo decks is that while you're getting an impressive board filled with negates and disruption, you're usually taking your entire hand to do this. Thus, if your opponent does manage to break your board, you'll often be left with so little resources that you've essentially lost even if your life points haven't reached 0. As you can imagine, this was not the case with Pepe. Firstly, the deck rarely used every card in its hand to make its end boards, since they usually didn't need that many monsters, as much of its disruption came from the counter traps. This usually left the deck with 2 to 3 cards in hand, turn 2, along with an extra deck full of pendulums to establish a game-ending board of Draco monsters and Exciton Knights to break whatever board our opponent had created and swing for lethal. This often meant that not only did opponents have to break Pepe's boards, which some decks like MERMAIL could actually do at the time, but they also had to have enough resources to finish the opponent that turn or risk being beaten on the crackback. This, along with a quick emergency ban, is why I placed this deck above SPYRAL, while considering which deck to call the most powerful, as at least with full power SPYRAL, there was always a chance you could break their board and leave them without many resources for a comeback. Not so with Pepe. Like I said though, this deck did not remain at full power very long, with Ptolemaeus, Plushfire and Juggler banned, and Joker, Monkey Board and Luster going to 1 within 13 days of the deck being released. This I think shows just how damaging Konami thought this deck was, as the set many of Pepe's cards came out in, Breakers of Shadow, were still being sold, and a major hit like this no doubt affected sales, something any company would loathe to do. Overall, Pepe was one of the most powerful decks Konami has ever made, greatly influenced how combo decks were played going forward, and was so strong Konami hit it faster than any other deck in the game's history. For this reason, I consider it the strongest deck in Yu-Gi-Oh history. So that was my list. Are there any decks you would have put on? Let me know in the comments, like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.